Hello and welcome back to the Fighting Anti-Intellectualism Livestream podcast, everybody. Today
Hello, hello.
it's hosted by me and Greg. Welcome back, Greg.
Welcome to you. Actually, I guess
And
I'm the one who really feels welcome. You're sort of the host of all this, aren't you?
we're both hosting.
Feel more
And
of
then
a
we got
feel more co than host. Anyway, yo, what's up, Nick?
we got little Nicky over here.
Little Nicky.
Oh
Is
shit!
there...
Now we got hit by Universal or whoever produced that movie.
Well, that's Little Nicky. They enunciate the two T's.
Oh,
It says Lil is an acronym in this
I
case,
said
so it's
little
not.
though.
I was saying more Lil. I was dropping the two T's and the E.
How about just Nick?
Okay.
We'll
So-
mostly call you Nick, but in jest, I will probably have to use Little Nicky.
Okay,
Just fair warning.
So today we're going to be talking about discrimination, particularly. I guess we could say the motion up for debate is whether or not African Americans, blacks, are being discriminated against in the way that the quote unquote woke community would say. I say quote because I don't really. When you say people talk about woke being like a religion or something, it's kind of vague. Like not a lot of people say they're woke.
We can
It's
talk
just
about like
if you it's
intersectional
kinda like,
activists, the activist wing of the far left.
calling
like
it woke is like calling what people are kind of against in schools, calling that CRT when it's not CRT.
Right, all the time.
It's just like it's a bad misnomer.
It is. Yeah, woke is too broad of a term. Most people who get referred to as woke, who like aren't just being accused of nothing for no reason, like people who are, let's say, disingenuous activists, they tend to be followers of like intersectional feminism. And when I say followers, like they kind of do follow, like when people like Robin DiAngelo like make up new terms or put new concepts forward. They're usually, it seems like they're sort of universally adopted. So it's fair to say followers. It's a activist wing of the far left, enamored with intersectional feminism, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, gender theory, like all this just sort of forms a coalition. It's loose. Referring to them as the woke is not that inaccurate, but yeah, it's definitely misused a lot. It's pretty annoying when it gets misused like that.
Yeah, and not to count that the wokeism is a religion is also kind of a secular religion. I hear sometimes kind of an oxymoron.
And it's just like hyperbole, and it's obnoxious. I like John McWhorter a lot, and I like that he's pointing out the religious elements of intersectional ideology. But I mean, yeah, referring to it as like the woke religion or like whatever, the cult of woke or the church of woke, like all that's just like annoying hyperbole, and there's no need for it.
I usually see it from people like Daily Wire's Matt Walsh, who I cannot stand. Love his beard, by the way. He has a great beard.
Beard, nice.
Yeah, he's got a nice beard.
As a beard man, I respect it.
I mean, there's a lot of people with political agendas which rely upon demonizing, people and trying to persuade people that the world is going against them. And wokeism has been a means to that end.
Right.
So any actual discussion of whatever issues going on just completely falls by the wayside because the focus ends up becoming on whatever that group is saying, whatever things that group is doing that someone views as wrong or societal change in a negative way. What might actually be an actual issue.
You brought up one thing that's like really fucking common, which is, wow, my mouth is foul today. I apologize to any viewers who are under a certain age, but you make a good point, which is that if you can just focus on what the other team said last week and just do a whole fucking special on that and never actually engage with the issues. And I think that's what a lot of people do when they're criticizing like wokeism. They just focus on like, look at this latest controversy rather than like actually trying to have a constructive discussion that leads to something. Like one problem on both sides, and when I say both sides, I mean like the radical elements on both sides, is like people are not trying to come to consensus. The goal should be consensus, because the more consensus you build, the more momentum you can get behind good policy to actually change things. But you don't see that. Like nobody on the extremes wants to go anywhere near consensus, even if it would be helpful for their own agenda.
Well, I think because one of the focuses on wokeism is about the changing of the attempt to change like societal norms, when some of the issues around like what we would call like systemic racism are not as much rooted in societal norms as people think, but a little bit more rooted on specific policies and specific means of doing things. And because people have either failed at dealing with specific policies, those are complicated to fix. We have a very large country with a lot of different communities, that it becomes kind of a little bit simpler to, or it's simpler to kind of raise awareness and to focus on these, societal norm changing things, which
cultural war issues,
which then you could completely ignore the thing that's causing a lot of the problems that lead to specific systemic racism.
So systemic racism is probably might be the only thing we need to talk about, because as someone like I have learned a tiny bit about various policies that I think constitute systemic racism, racism embedded in legal structures and other stuff. That's what I consider systemic racism. That does seem to be a thing, and I feel comfortable calling it that. Any discrimination, any racial discrimination, like let's say specifically against Black people, because they're the ones who are targeted by most of these laws and policies. I guess laws are policies. I'm just going to be like the ignorant rambler, and then Nick can always just correct my terms because he actually like reads shit. So Black people are the ones who've mostly been targeted. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm glad you're pulling up stats on them, because we will probably be pulling some up today. This is going to be good.
Oh, trust me. Yes.
Oh yeah, no, it's good. It's good. Finishing point. Smoked weed today already, and so already losing my point. My point is that I do think that's a thing. Systemic racism. Oh yeah, and so any discrimination that's happening, I think, can be traced back to systemic racism. So it's like discrimination is sort of the superficial layer, but what we'll probably really be talking about today is systemic racism.
Yeah. You point out to confidence in the police and stuff, especially. And I think one of the major focuses on systemic racism had been over policing. That seems to be the primary belief, the primary issue, the primary belief, belief that the police are biased, the belief that the police are racists in many circumstances, or that the policies that the police are following are racist, or that they're or that when they're doing a shooting, they are acting out of fear or racism and killing somebody. And that seems to be the predominant belief, that there's implicit bias that the police are following, which is then leading to them, which is systemic racism in that view. I think that's a little. I think.
Sorry, all these things I'm scrolling through, supposed to be what Black Americans face in terms of systemic racism and 9 charts. None of this proves systemic racism.
Yeah, so
most of it is stuff that just is either happenstance or what personal feelings are, which is not what systemic racism is.
And I think and this is one of the problems. This is actually one of the problems of discussion about systemic racism, is that people tend to look at how people perceive race
kind of stuff,
instead of what and inequalities, and that is not and that may prove racism, but in a country where there's lots of inequalities for all different reasons, cultural, political, all sorts of different reasons, that's not quite as persuasive. And that's one of the problems, is that you're just relying on kind of people's beliefs. There is actual systemic racism, I would argue, but it's, like in Ferguson, for example, is a really good example. What you look at is more nickel and diming laws and enforcement of laws against poverty, which like anti-poverty laws, sort of laws that fine people for loitering, prostitution, marijuana possession. That's where I feel like systemic racism falls more into realms of areas that Americans are somewhat unwilling to make major adjustments in, or at least politically. For various reasons, the government has struggled or been unwilling, probably more not because America is systemically racist, but because there is some lobbying around those issues. Like marijuana legalization faces significant impediments, even if 70% of Americans, want marijuana legalized. Congress is unable to actually do it because there's enough lobbying and enough political beliefs about whether or not should be legal or not, that the fact that it is one of the reasons why these systemically racist practices happen, that it doesn't go anywhere. So,
I just want to just cinch up that point for me. The reason that it doesn't go anywhere is because people are. Wait, why were you saying that there isn't consensus around legalizing marijuana? What was your explanation for that?
So there's consensus in the public. There's 70% of support for legalizing marijuana at the federal level, but within the people who are the most important voters, some in a 50-50 Senate with Republicans and Democrats, because of lobbying by various groups that are committed, that don't like the idea of marijuana being legalized for various reasons. I'm still not entirely sure. There's a lot of fear of what happens if you legalize it. There's just a lot of people who don't believe in legalizing it for one reason or another. They think it's a drug and it's harmful.
Drugs, yeah.
I'll tell you what happens if you legalize it. Everyone gets the munchies and goes to Taco Bell.
Pretty much.
Then the economy will boom.
Pretty much.
And then eventually everyone will just sit home high.
I mean, the Senate is made up of 50 individuals, and some of them just don't believe in legalizing it, for example. I have specifically heard.
It's not just that. I can't get a job with the Portland police because I smoked pot in the past year, which is just dumb. It's not like Yeah, it's that's why I was rejected, is because of that. And it's like, why does that matter? Who cares if I even do it? It's just a plant. It's like drinking alcohol. It's the same thing, and inebriates you for
but they
a
all
short
drink,
time.
or most of them.
But that's
Right. So, because of I do have their specific points I want to hit, but just to wrap up your point, Nick. So, because of these various factors, lobbying that prevents marijuana from being legal, this law, which is marijuana being outlawed, continues to perpetuate this systemically racist policy. The law is in place. The policy of let's arrest lots of black teenagers and black young people for smoking a joint.
Well, it's not.
Keep them in
police
prison.
Officers don't go into black neighborhoods, and I don't think to necessarily arrest black people for marijuana. But when we have, we do have since Giuliani, the tough on crime laws, and we are dealing with a crime wave, right? People where the continuing crime.
Oh shit! I gotta go. I gotta leave. Okay, I'm leaving. Well,
this was fun.
So
we'll resume. We should resume this at a later date.
No, it's fine. He's coming back in. He says he has to leave for a few minutes. I can take over. There's a lot of stuff yet to consider. I mean, you can consider, like, what exactly is systemic racism? Well, and where's the evidence for it? Because just because they go and arrest black kids for marijuana does not mean that's because of racism.
It's not. But the that black people are like a ravening force. I
am sorry.
That's okay. I think we saw in Ferguson, Missouri, specifically, what I would call systemic racism is attempts to penalize poverty, to a combination of the broken window police theory, which then leads to a lot of policing of neighborhoods, and you can argue about the utility of the broken window police theory of policing, but where you push everyone in, you put tons of police into predominantly black communities where there is a higher crime, in at least according to the city, there's higher crime in those communities, and you put them in, and you arrest a lot of black people for minor offenses, and then they develop criminal records, and then they cannot find jobs because they have criminal records, or it's harder for them to find jobs. I will not say it's impossible, because people have said you can still find a job, but it's going to be quite a bit harder. And that's what systemic racism to me is, a combination of policies and the idea from a lot of people who are social justice activists is this is a planned thing to try to hurt the black communities, to perpetrate white supremacy and divide the country, I guess. That is the belief about systemic racism, I would say, and that this country is built on white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure all those factors quite match up, but at least the end result is a lot of black people with criminal records being arrested for minor charges, and being basically, at least in Ferguson for the riots, they became a revenue source for the government, because the government basically would just would concentrate their policing efforts, and they get money from arresting people, and that is the perceived systemic. That is the best version to me of what systemic racism would be.
Redlining and systemic racism have not decreased over the past 30 decades as white Americans have suggested. This essay's author suggests that systemic racism is not a black African American problem, but rather a white American problem. Unfortunately, African Americans have been affected by racism. White Americans have against people of color, especially black African Americans. Redlining was a reinforcement of systemic racism has been perpetuated by the federal government in collaboration with the private real estate industry since 1937. All housing policies have been distinguished as only served white American communities. Disingenuous. Yeah. So one of the things that people usually say for systemic racism, and probably their better arguments, although it just happens to be false, is redlining. Black Americans back then and still are today very poor, right? Do we agree on that generally?
I mean, statistically, the poverty rates in the African American community are higher than I think every other American.
If you were born black, what are the chances you would say of being poor?
Significantly higher than any other.
Okay. So you have a higher chance of being poor. If you have money, they're not going to deny you. I doubt it. Because the reason why redlining existed is not because they were black. Is rather, hey, black people typically on average don't have money, and if they come in and they don't have money, they can be denied because you got to pay the bank back. The bank is looking for a way to make money off the situation, and they don't see black Americans then, and probably if this still going on today, which I doubt, would probably keep the same train of thought that they're less likely to pay back, and so they're not clients they want to work with. It's not because they're black; it's just because that group may have a history of not paying back loans. I don't know. I haven't seen the studies on that. But I'm likely going to say that what I'm saying probably is the most logical.
I would say that there are one or two issues with that. The first issue is that there are a history of housing covenants where suburbs were specifically formed, which did ban African Americans from moving to those suburbs. So even if they had the bank loans or the money, there were specific laws which made it illegal. Now, it was also legal for Jews to move to certain subdivisions in the 50s, 40s, etc. So it's a little bit more complicated, but I think there is some combination of, and some of those covenants, I think are all technically illegal at this point.
They're already illegal. Like you can't discriminate against someone because of their race.
You can't, but they did have. But those were historically those were. Now today,
I'm saying but that's not relevant anymore.
Well, I think systemic racism ends up becoming this kind of historical thing where it's like, well, we didn't have wealth then, so we didn't have the wealth now because of these historical acts, which is what the systemic racism argument is more. That's why it ends up becoming more of a history thing, which makes it more complicated and confusing instead of assessing, well, what are the, to my knowledge, there have been some banks who have been fined for discriminatory processes, for discriminatory and predatory loan practices. I don't know how much those have been, but I do know that there have been accusations around such companies as Bank of America of still perpetrating redlining and discrimination and racial. I believe racial discrimination had come up in some of these lawsuits, and they have at times settled or faced fines. So there is some evidence that is still going on, even though it is illegal. But how to fix that is a more complicated question, I would say. And that is because banks have very opaque rules, very opaque institutions. But yeah, you're right. If you don't have as much money, you're going to have a hard time finding a house as well. So I would probably say there's some combination of issues there.
Yeah, but this blame is because they're simply black, though. Is like nowadays is not really a thing. So then that's one thing taken away from the argument of systemic racism that we can claim as false, and more of an argument against it, if anything.
I mean, I do think that there have been accusations. There was a Bank of America was fined for racial discrimination in 20, I believe it was 2011. They were fined like $335 million.
Who?
Bank of America.
Oops.
So Bank of America was fined, accused by the Department of Justice of discrimination, where a very large number of qualified African American and Hispanic borrowers were charged with higher rates solely because of their race or national origin. That's what the federal government accused them of. So I think here with redlining,
when did this happen?
This was 2011.
Okay, here it is.
So I mean that's relatively recently. So I don't think there is an argument that that's still going on or has been going on, and that's still an issue today. But as I said, these are specific issues. I don't know if trying to get rid of a lot of the attempts has been on a lot of attention has been on the Confederate flag, on these symbolic things, and a lot of these are specific government regulatory functions. I don't know why Bank of America did this. I would not say that in itself is something that should be investigated.
But they were struck down, weren't they? On that, they lost.
Bank of America.
But that's not systemic racism, because that's just a company just doing that. I mean, if you want to say technically, it's private systemic racism in a particular business.
I mean, I think there have been other companies.
That's about it.
I think there have been other companies that have also been accused of it at other banks. I don't think Bank of America is the only company. I think it has been. I'm not. Chase.
But these are still isolated, though.
Well, these companies but these companies do have a fair amount of economic leverage. We're not talking about small institutions here. We're talking about there's only 7 or 8 big banks. Bank of America is massive. It controls a massive amount of the U.S. economy in terms
of. What about Wells Fargo?
Or Wells Fargo, yeah. There's only 5 or 6 or 7 major banks, and I'm pretty sure most of them have been accused or have paid some sort of fines in these areas. I don't know if all of them have, but I do know many of them have been accused, and that I would say is at least racism in the private enterprise system of banking. I think that is something which needs to be. But again, I don't know. These are we're focused more on these symbolic things when there are actual things going on. To look at why are they doing that. I'd like to know who's being held accountable. Why is the Department of Justice running? Why is this still going on? Why are they breaking the law? But there isn't a lot of accountability in these large institutions.
Yeah, but the government hasn't shown any sympathy for them, have they?
For the institutions?
Yes.
No, they have not, and they have found them guilty of. They have actually made them pay fines and such. So I think that.
So then, systemic racism, which they're usually talking about in the government as systemic racism,
yes,
that would then you're just proving that it doesn't exist there.
Well, I think the systemic racism is a societal thing, and it's mostly focused on the government, which is why you do make a good point that it's more of that there is debatable evidence for that, because the government does kind of come in and has penalized police departments for systemic racism. But when you're thinking of systemic racism, people think, does this stuff still happen? Maybe the government comes and cleans it up, but do these types of incidents still occur at some point? And that's what they think of as systemic racism, which is someone doing something still. Even if the government comes and cleans it up later, they think, well, these things keep going on, so the system is still against me, even though the system is actually.
But they think it's but they're making it seem like it's this white oligarchy cult of some kind that sacrifices babies or something, and controls the way the world works. And it's like,
Yeah.
whites are usually the most independent race.
Of what?
Like, we're not as community based as other races are.
What is that? What does that mean? I don't even know.
The African community, African American
Oh.
community, is traditionally shown to be much more community based rather
Yes.
than individualist. It's the same could be said with the Asian communities. Most of the Asian communities the same way.
Yeah, so there isn't like a
But
strong
with whites, there's a lot of about trying to be independent.
Yeah, there isn't like a strong white community, strong like white sort of. I mean,
So the idea that this bleeds and trickles down into every one of us, like we're brainwashed fools. Oh, Trump spoke. Our God Emperor, we must obey him. Is just inane.
I mean, I think that there is a certain amount of lack of interest in people have always been. I think a lot of people either just were horrified by police shootings, and a lot of the information about systemic racism. You know, the Justice Department was finding these people before the Floyd riot, before Black Lives Matter showed up. The Justice Department was investigating these companies and still finding them for systemic racism. But maybe with cell phone footage, there was kind of a shock, and people didn't care as much. People wanted to feel more optimistic about their country. So I think the ideas of systemic racism more come as a sort of shock to, well, I think everything's okay in my country and it doesn't look like it is. So that's what leads to kind of this grand conspiracy of the white people, I guess, that kind of shows up in systemic racism is kind of that people tend to gravitate towards conspiracy theories about these things, but I would agree that most most white people are not running Bank of America.
Yeah.
But I think I'd like to see more studies done of large institutions and what they have done, because they do discriminate. They have been accused of discrimination and found guilty of discrimination, and I think that's worthy of study.
Makes sense.
Like,
but
we don't. Sorry.
No. I'm just trying to think. What would be the next thing to go on about? See where the contention here is.
I mean, there is the continuing issues. There's the police, banks. Those are the two most things people.
Police.
And
let's
the
talk
media.
About police.
What?
So let's talk about police.
Yeah. So, I mean, so we have, and this is where the systemic racism argument seems to most run into, I guess, resistance, because I would agree that the banks do discriminate. That's systemic discrimination. I agree with that. To some extent, obviously, there's some argument to be made, but in the police, there is both a perception of history that the police were originally around to catch slaves, and they just never really changed, and that discrimination came, and they have an ugly history with Bull Connor and from desegregation, and now they're just sent into police black communities. So there's that perception that they're basically just a continuing tool of government, white people to suppress black people. There's that perception, right?
Oh, but I would disagree that's true.
I mean, I don't think most people.
I don't think that most police do not give a shit about your race. They just don't care. They're just trying to do their job. Like, they act like the protests here, the police are white supremacists, as if they're out there to hunt down the black person. They're not. They don't care. I've spoken to them. They don't care.
Yeah,
like, they don't want to be out in the streets in a rainy day, away from their families, working extra hours, probably not getting paid extra for it either, because people can't follow basic rules and regulations to keep safety.
Yeah, I mean, police have been told I think the belief is that the drug war led to the police being ordered to go into these communities, and since the drug war, there were some racial dog whistles to start the drug war, and the drug war never really ended. The police became unwilling tools of a sort of racial oppression fight that started in the 60s or 70s, depending on whatever you want to call the war on drugs started.
Yeah, maybe it did at one point, but right now, most people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, we just don't care. And a lot of them are becoming new police officers. Some of the old ones are so old they just don't give a shit anymore. I mean, people change. You can't expect a 6-year-old to hold the same views he had in the 70s.
Well, the police largely don't, because of the police officer's job, they largely do not have some uniform ideas when they don't want to betray each other. So even if someone does something wrong, they do not want to betray that officer. And there was a lot of contention during the Black Lives Matter protests around police officers who said, there was people who took off their badges and said, I don't want to be a part of this. And there were others who said, I'm with the protesters. And there was a whole, Blue Lives Matter movement to try to support police officers because of the constant assaults on police officers. When, I mean, most of this doesn't have that much to do with the individual police officers per se. I mean, there's a lot of belief around but they're being told to go into these communities and they end up writing up lots of tickets and being heavily policing these communities. And that's more of the problem, in my opinion, than the police officer being racially discriminated. They're ordered to go into a predominantly black community and maintain order and write up a lot of tickets because of the broken windows policing policy and the war on drugs. And that leads to a constant kind of conflict with the black community to some extent and a lack of trust. And them being seen very poorly, and sometimes police shootings. But generally speaking, since crime remains really relatively high, and people have the public is not really willing to let go of those types of policies because there is still a relatively high crime rate. And this is where these arguments to try to defund the police or have less police officers and focus more on mental health, they run into a brick wall because whenever someone sees higher crime rates or believes in higher crime rates, the police are frequently the first people called to deal with that. But when you think of systemic racism, I mean, people look at these police shootings, they obsess. So, did the man have to fire 10 shots? He fired 10 shots. Did he have to do that? Was he scared because he might have been racially biased? This leads to
probably thought he was going to miss.
This leads to constant speculation about one officer being racist. That officer got scared, that officer was biased, and that officer pulled the trigger. And that's when people think of systemic racism. But this discussion is not very helpful because, instead of talking about, well, why do we have to put the police in these communities? Why do they have to go and arrest a lot of people to stop crime? We end up talking about whether or not this officer, thought twice when they pulled the trigger. And that leads to constant speculation and the public being very divided because you don't really know why he fired 10 shots. You can say, well, he seemed nervous. He seemed, agitated. With the Freddie Gray murder, death. And that's where these discussions keep on running into different people's views of the police instead of looking at kind of objectively what's going on. Is you end up analyzing these singular incidents and saying that's systemic racism, but these are much more squishy arguments, and I think that's not very healthy.
Makes sense.
Like you're right, most police officers probably do not join the force to go and arrest people or shoot people. I don't think most people do. Most police officers do. Most of them are probably not. I don't think most police officers join to be, racially biased, going after one group. I don't, as you said, I don't think that's really that common anymore. But the continued history and the poor treatment and the constant involvement of the black community with the police officers creates that perception, I think.
Yeah. Well, Greg hasn't come back, so I think we should kind of stop here until he comes back.
We can stop it here. Good chat.
Good chat. Let me go ahead and end the broadcast.